You're listening to the Maritime Gardening Podcast, brought to you by Vessi Seeds and Savers Gardening Products. Well, folks, today I got an interesting topic for you, and it's kind of a summary topic of a lot of themes I touch on in my videos, and a bit of a teaser to a video I'm going to be making soon. And the theme of this podcast is tips for planning a garden, all the things you need to think of, you know, whether you're in a situation where you have no garden and you're going to make one, you know, you got a lawn or a field and you're going to turn it into a garden, or in the case that you've got a garden and you haven't ordered your seeds for the coming year and you're trying to think of what do I want to try to grow, where should it all go, planning it all out, right? So regardless of what situation you're in, this is going to be a useful podcast for you. Unless, of course, you don't think you need to think about that, right? So let's get going here. So the first thing you need to think about when you're planning a garden, whether you have no garden at all or you've got an established garden and you're just trying to decide where everything's going to go, is where is the sun? Where is the sun in terms of all the different spaces in that garden? I mean, you think of a garden as a big circle or a big rectangle with rectangles in it. So I'm going to use the term garden bed in this video. And when I say garden bed, I mean remember, I'm a no-till gardener, and no-till gardens tend to have places where you walk, walking paths, and they tend to have beds, places where you plant. And the walking paths are always walking paths, and the beds are always beds, okay? So a walking path never becomes a bed, generally speaking, okay? So we're going to go with that principle. If you don't like that, you're probably not going to find this very interesting. But that's the idea of most no-till gardens, is there's places where you walk and there's places where you grow. And the places where you grow are not places where you walk. So the places where you grow, I'm going to refer to those as beds. Okay? And when I refer to a bed, generally speaking, it doesn't have to be this way, but I'm going to be referring to a garden bed that is about 4 feet by 8 feet, 4 feet wide by 8 feet long. Okay, it doesn't have to be that. It can be 3 by 10. It can be whatever. I tend to go with 4 by 8 because I can reach to the middle from one side, right? 2-foot reach. I can actually reach about 3 feet, but I wouldn't want a bed that was 6 feet wide. It was just, you know, the middle of a 6-foot wide bed. I have a couple. I think I've got one 7 by 7 bed or 8 by 8 bed. And it's difficult to get into the middle of the bed, and it's just not comfortable. It works for the way the space is laid out there, but it's not optimal for sure. It's an optimal use of space in terms of area, but anyway. So when I say bed, I mean a bed that's roughly a rectangle that's about 4 by 8. Doesn't have to be a rectangle. You could have a circle that has a 5-foot diameter. Okay, you've got options, all right? So where is the sun? This is important because you got to think of your garden as this large, let's say it's a large rectangle. It doesn't have to be a large rectangle, but it's a large rectangle full of rectangles, full of 4 by 8 rectangles with spaces in between them. Okay, that space may not, every single corner, every single location within that larger space may not get equal sun during the day. Right? Some spaces might get 6 hours of sun a day. Some spaces within your garden area might get 12 hours of sun a day at the height of summer, right? And of course, the position of the sun changes over the course of the spring, summer, and fall. I asked someone the other day, someone was asking me, I want to grow tomatoes on my deck. Where will they grow on my deck? And I said, well, you know, how much sun do you get a day? She said, the sun always rises at 10 o'clock and then it's gone by noon. And so that's impossible because the sun rises, at least in the northern hemisphere where I am, the sun rises in a different, it rises in a different position as the season changes. So, you know, in the winter right now, we're sort of it doesn't look like it. This is normally the coldest time of the year. I mean, for those that are on audio here, it's all green around me here. It's green and brown, and there's no snow on the ground. Usually, you know, when we're approaching the beginning of February, this is the coldest time of year, and there's usually snow and ice, and it's usually cold. It's amazing. I don't even have gloves on as I'm doing this video. But this is not a typical February. This is the warmest warmest winter I can remember in my life for here in this location. Anyway, this time of year, the sun rises, this way is south over here. The sun rises in the southeast, and it doesn't go, it's never overhead, right? It rises, it stays on an angle, and then it sets in the southwest. Okay, rises in the southeast, sets in the southwest. It's always over there. So now I'm not growing anything this time of year, so it doesn't matter. But then once we hit the spring equinox, the sun, this way is east behind me here, the sun rises due east. It rises right in the east, okay, and it sets right in the west, and it goes straight up overhead, so the sun's actually over your head. And then once we hit the summer solstice, you know, around, I don't know, July or whatever, the sun actually rises over there in the northeast. It actually rises in the northeast and sets in the northwest. So the sun, put it another way, the sun rises in, you know, early in the growing season, it rises in the east around the spring equinox, right? That's about as early as I can get anything going here is the spring equinox, you know. So it rises in the east, and then over the course of the growing season, it starts rising more northeast, and then as we get into October, it, you know, as we get back to the fall equinox, it goes back to rising in the east, and then as we're going, you know, towards the winter solstice, it goes back to rising in the southeast. That affects where the sun lays, where the sun shines in your gardening space, and you know, that's just something you have to take into account depending on what you want to grow and how much sun it needs, right? You have to think about that sort of thing. Where's the sunniest spot? That's where you want your tomatoes and your heat-loving things and your peppers and, you know, anything that likes a lot of sun and a lot of heat and really doesn't do well without that. Those spots have to be, you know, where those plants go. You can't put them anywhere else, or they're just not going to do well, especially if you're in a northern climate. I mean, you can bend some rules if you're living somewhere that's really hot, because I mean, the plants need sun, they also need heat. And a place like this where I live, where it's relatively cool in the summer, if the plants aren't in the sun, they're not going to be warm. The sun's not going to be on the soil, it's not going to be warming that up. Some plants, you know, they like a lot of sun, and they need a lot of sun, but they also, the roots underneath those plants want to be in warm soil. They really need to be in warm soil. So if you've got a location that's not getting enough sun, the roots aren't also going to function as well as they should, because the soil isn't warming up the way it should. So if you're somewhere that's just like, if you live in a major city like Toronto, or, you know, New York or Chicago, whatever, right? It's going to be hot all summer long no matter what, right? It's just hot, right? So maybe your plant that, you know, your heat-loving, your sun-loving plant, your sun-needing plant can do just fine with it. You know, the minimum amount of sun required. Let's say you've got a plant that needs 6 hours of sun a day minimum, like I think a tomato is that. It's like a bare minimum. But a tomato in a place like that would do a lot better because the ground's going to be warm no matter what, because it's just hot there. A place like where I live, where it gets down, you know, it cools off every single night. We're near the ocean. That soil has to warm up every single day. The soil doesn't stay warm overnight. It gets cool at night here. I'm next to a forest. I'm next to the North Atlantic Ocean. So anything that needs heat here has to be getting like 12 hours of sun a day. It can't have any shade, right? That's just the situation I'm in. And that's just me understanding my gardening space and how it works. So you have to be aware of all of that. So it's really important to understand, where is the sun in your gardening space? Where's the sunniest space? Where's the least sunniest space? That's going to dictate, that's going to constrain where things can go. There's some things they just have to go. If you want that plant and it needs a lot of sun, it has to go where the best sun is. If you got, and all your other plants, you work around those prima donna plants that need that good sun. Okay. The second consideration is if you're going to grow perennials. I'm talking about vegetable garden here. If you're going to grow perennials, where are they going to go? Because they're going to have to work around any sort of idea you have of crop rotation, right? Where are the perennials going to go? Because wherever you put your perennials, they're going to stay there. You're not going to be moving them around. Some perennials take years to get established. Grapes take like 5 years before they start producing, give or take, right? Asparagus takes like 5 years. Apple trees take 5. Everything takes a number of years. The root systems have to get really, really well established. A lot of berries, all those sort of perennials, they take years to get established, and then they start producing. So any perennial you position in your garden isn't going anywhere. So you're going to lose that space in terms of the options you have for it. So you got to think of where they're going to go. And to go back to the first point, where's the sun? How tall is that perennial? How much shade is it going to cast on the things north of it, right? Think about the sun, in the summer, sort of rising at east, setting in the west. Where's the sun? Where is that plant, if it's a tall plant like an apple tree or something with a lot of foliage and it's a perennial? How much shade is it going to cast because of its height? That's going to limit what you can plant near that. If you're planting something near it that needs a lot of sun. So you got to think about that. So for me, my garden's over there. I tend to plant all my tall perennials at the north end of the garden, right? As far north as I can put them, and sort of think of the garden as a rectangle, right? They're all at the north end of the garden because they're not going to cast any shade on things north of that. They're going to cast shade on the north, but since they're at the north end of the garden, they're casting shade on not garden, so they're not causing a problem, okay? If you have a perennial that's short, like I got some lingonberries, they're a little short sort of bush, so I can put them anywhere, right? And they like sun, but there's options for that because they're not complete sun hogs like some other things. So I've got options for that plant, right? Because they're small. It doesn't matter what's on either side of that plant. It doesn't matter if they're on the south side of a heat-loving plant, because they're not going to cast any shade on anything, so I don't have to worry about that, right? And it's also important to understand where your perennials are going, because they're going to affect your options for rotating your crops around, right? Because you're basically taking that bed out of the equation. If you put raspberries in a bed, that's a raspberry bed. Sure, there's some things you can companion plant in with the raspberries and stuff like that, but what I'm trying to say is the raspberries aren't being moved. If you get raspberries and you get them established and you move them, it's going to be, all things being equal, it's going to be a while before you've got good producing raspberry plants again. So wherever you commit to putting most of your perennials, you're kind of, that space is taken out of the equation for where things can go. So just think about that. How many perennials do I want? Which ones do I want? How much do I value the fruit? It's usually fruit, but not always. How much do I value what they're producing? Is it really something I like? Is it really something I'm going to eat? Is it something, am I the only person in my house that likes it? Does everybody else like it? Right? That sort of thing. You got to think about those sorts of things. Next consideration, what do I want to grow? And how much of each thing do I need? I mean, this is really important because a lot of new gardeners, they plant a whole bunch of stuff and then they don't know what to do with it and they're trying to give it away. You got to think about, usually sometimes it's the case that everybody in the house is into the gardening. But sometimes it's the case that it's just you. You're the gardener. Everybody else is just sort of there. And they're helping you or whatever. So the fact that there's a particular vegetable you like doesn't necessarily mean everyone in your household is going to like it. Now, maybe you can find some way to convince them that it's better than they thought. Maybe they've just never had it cooked properly, whatever. So sure, plant that thing, give it a try. But if it's year 3 and you have to fight with everyone in your house to eat whatever the thing is, Brussels sprouts or something like that, look, my opinion is if nobody in your house likes that thing, plant a couple for yourself, but really don't commit a lot of gardening space to growing that thing because it's just you. For instance, as a perfect example, people are always sort of mystified at how few tomatoes I grow. And it's because I'm the only one in the house that really likes fresh tomatoes. Well, my wife doesn't, she'll eat them in a salad, but she's not fond of them in a salad. My daughter will eat a cherry tomato if she's out in the garden, but again, she's not, she doesn't. My son eats, I guess, tomato sandwiches if there's bacon in it, right? But I'm the kind of guy, I can sit down and eat 5 tomatoes and not even think twice about it. I love tomatoes. My idea of a snack is a tomato sandwich, or just eating 3 or 4 tomatoes. I love tomatoes. So I'm pretty much growing the tomatoes for me. and the handful that I don't eat is for everybody else. So, I mean, yeah, I could devote other beds to growing, tomatoes for sauces and stuff like that. But, it's to a certain extent, there's a lot of other things I can grow in those garden spaces, and I can just buy tomato paste and stuff like that, and it's ready to go. I can buy, canned tomatoes are relatively inexpensive. Sure, sometimes they're not as good as your homemade ones, and that's a whole nother argument, because people are going to be like, what do you mean you buy canned tomatoes? Well, because I'd have to devote a huge amount of my garden to tomatoes. And the canned tomatoes, they're very inexpensive to buy, so I use that sort of thing, right? But again, these are just equations you have to figure out for yourself, right? For me, I would rather grow, everybody in my house will eat squash. So if I get a spare bed, I choose whether to grow squash or tomatoes. I know everybody likes squash, so squash gets the space. If I grew more tomatoes, we're never going to eat that many tomatoes fresh. So now I just created a whole bunch of work because I have to can all those tomatoes in some way. Whereas with the squash, I just pick them and stick them on a shelf in my garage and eat them in February. A lot easier, right? So those are the sort of considerations I go through, right? What do you want? What does everybody like? What are you going to eat? And how much of it do you need? Certain vegetables that are very easy to store, I grow a lot of those. Potatoes are easy to store. You pick them out, sort of cure them a little bit. That just means get them sort of dried out, and then put them somewhere reasonably cool, and they just keep. I mean, they're unbelievably easy to store, right? The work involved, as opposed to like using a dehydrator or vacuum sealing or canning under pressure. All that sort of stuff is more work than just picking something, setting it out to dry for a few days, sticking it in a cardboard box and eating it months later when you want it, right? Or like a squash, just cut it off the vine, stick it on a shelf somewhere that's not too hot, not too cold, and eat it later. For me, I'd rather devote the space to things that everybody likes, that's really easy to store, assuming I've got a decent variety of different things. You don't want to have all one thing, of course, right? But that's the sort of way I think about it, but you got to do what works for you. But that's another consideration for your garden. How big does it need to be? How much of everything do I want? How much of everything can I use? That's a really important consideration. It's something people don't think about when they're new to gardening. They get too much of one thing, they don't know what to do with it, and stuff gets thrown away, and then they think it's pointless. Oh, I grew all those beans, and then half of them just went to waste. You got to think about that sort of thing. Okay. Number 4, paths and beds. Think about, if you've got a large geometric space, a rectangle or a circle or whatever. My garden isn't a perfect rectangle. It looks like an amoeba, if anything. It's a weird shape. It follows the contour of the land. It's not a perfect geometric shape. But whatever that shape is, think about the optimal use of the space in terms of how many beds you can get in there, how much of that space you can convert to bed space, and how much of that area you need for path space access. And think about the widths of your paths. I mean, if the narrower your paths are, the more bed space you have, but then your garden becomes kind of unnavigable, right? And if you've got really long beds, let's say you had 20-foot long beds, well, then you got to go all the way around them, right? Smaller beds you can sort of get from bed to bed. It can be easier, right? So a long, big bed makes better use of the space, but it's difficult to garden, difficult to manage, difficult to get around because you don't want to walk on your soil. You got to go around all these things. So there's a size that's optimal. I've got 4 foot 10 beds. I've got 4 foot 8 beds. I got some beds that are like 6 foot 5 or like 4.5 by 6, 4.5 by 5.5, something like that. They look square, but they're rectangular. And I've got one bed that's 7 by 7-ish. I kind of like the 4 by 8. If I were to redesign this thing from scratch, it would be organized around that principle, I think. Although I always play with the idea of having a garden made of circles or something. I mean, a circle is a very efficient use of space. Something to be said for that. Anyway, that's something. It's all stuff you got to think about. And in terms of the pathway, there's a certain pathway that is ideal, optimally the right size for maneuvering a wheelbarrow and maneuvering your body. You want to be able to sit side on to a garden bed, so there has to be enough room to do that. You know, you don't want to sit sideways and be half bent over managing the bed. You want to be able to sit, let's say, perpendicular to the length of a garden. So the walking path has to be wide enough for there to be enough space between your toe of your foot and your knee, so you can sit perpendicular to the garden bed. For me, that's, I don't know, something like 24 inches, I think, off the top of my head. I don't know, I don't measure it. When I'm putting beds down, I just literally put my foot against one bed, and I put my hand in front of my knee, and I jam the other bed up against my hand. So it's basically like an inch or so. You know, it's the length from my knee to my toe, plus an inch or so. That way I know I can kneel next to that bed and reach into it, and I can position my body perpendicular to the bed and get at it. Okay, that's my mentality anyway. You also got to make decisions about, with your beds, you know, what kind of material they're made of. Are you going to make it out of wood? What kind of wood? How much do you want to spend, right? You can spend a lot of money buying cedar because it doesn't go bad and it doesn't rot out. It's going to rot out eventually. It's in contact with soil. Anything that's in contact with soil in perpetuity is going to rot eventually. You can get, you know, womanized, pressure-treated lumber. You know, there's some types of that really don't have anything in them that's bad for the soil. But you know, some people get worried about that. I don't use any of that in my garden. All my gardens, I just use spruce 2x6 because it's cheap. It's the cheapest wood I can get. I find it lasts about seven years, give or take. Really depends, right? But about 7 years, and it starts to really fall apart and get a bit rotten. That's fine with me. I mean, for a one garden bed 4x8, it uses about $20 worth of lumber. So that's, you know, I don't mind spending that every 7 years. It's not a big deal. But I've also got beds. I like that system. I like the 2x6, 4x8 bed. I really like that. And it's easier to slap. I mean, I've done videos where I've used logs and used stuff like that. They all work, right? But in terms of speed and, you know, best use of space and geometry and all that sort of stuff, I do like the 4x8 bed made with 2x6. You know, really, people like raised beds because they say it's better for your back. But the bed has to be very high for it to actually save your back. I mean, if my beds are only 6 inches high and the soils are maybe only a few inches above grade, but if it was going to be saving my back, I'd have to make the thing like 3 feet high. I mean, if it was a foot higher, I'd still have to bend over. You know, if it was a foot and a half higher, I'd still have to bend over to work the garden. I'm 6'4". They'd have to be ridiculously high for me not to bend over. Since I've got to bend over anyway, I'd prefer to just kneel, right? And if you can't kneel, then you've got to work around all that sort of stuff, right? If you can't kneel, then, you know, you're probably going to have to bring it up. But these are all considerations you have to think of. The more material you put into raising your garden, the more you have to spend. And if you're making them out of wood, that's just the more material you're going to have to replace every so many years. And if you make them out of stone or cinder blocks or whatever, then it gets more expensive, right? Or if you're making them out of steel, galvanized metal or whatever, something like that, that gets expensive. So these are all things you have to think about in terms of how much value you're getting out of the garden, how much is it going to cost to build it, how important is it to you, that sort of thing. Also, there's the case of you know, cost versus durability, right? How much does that material cost? How long is it going to last? I mean, I got some beds that are just made of, you know, it's fairly rocky where I live, so I can find, you know, large rocks, pretty easy to find. So I've got beds that are made out of large rocks, go around it. So it costs nothing, highly durable, great. Disadvantage to large rocks is that if you get a 4x8 bed, it makes a pretty good barrier for a lot of things. And it's easy, you can sort of sit on the edge of it, you can sort of kneel against it, there's a lot you can do with that lumber. You can't really kneel on rocks. It's very uncomfortable to kneel on a rock. And the rock takes up a lot of space. Think about a garden that's, you know, let's say roughly 4x8, but you've got rocks that are like 9 inches in diameter. Well, the bed can't be wider than 4 feet wide. The outside edge has to be 4 feet wide. And because your rocks are 9 inches in diameter, it means you've taken away 18 inches from the actual planting space of the bed. So your 4x8 bed's actually 3x8, right? Because you've taken 18 inches away because you're using 9-inch diameter rocks. So your 4x8 bed that's made with rocks doesn't have anywhere near as much planting space as a 4x8 bed that's made with 2x6, because they're only like 1 3/4 inches wide. You're only giving up 3 inches to lumber, 3 inches to garden bed material, as opposed to giving up 18 inches to garden bed material. So these are all considerations you have to think of as well. And the rocks, using them as for garden beds, for borders, look really nice. It gives it a real earthy, Stonehenge-y sort of old country sort of medieval look, right? The rocks are also advantageous because they gather and hold heat. My garden beds that have rocks, I mean, today looks like April today. Feels like the beginning of, this is what April feels like sometimes. It feels like April, and it's bloody February. I can't believe how warm it is. Anyway, when there is snow and there is ice, which is usually the case in February, the beds with the rocks are the ones that, the snow disappears adjacent to the rocks first. Those are the beds that thaw out first. Those are the beds that are ready for planting first, because those rocks gather and hold heat, right? So it's an advantage of rocks. So everything's got its pluses and minuses. Sometimes I lie in bed when I can't sleep. I mull these things over. What is the best garden bed material? Cheap, doesn't take up a lot of space, doesn't rot, and so on and so forth. I've never figured it out. Clearly, because I use logs, I use rocks, I use 2x6, right? I just use whatever, right? I use lots of different things. I don't like spending money on gardens. I'm always amazed at some of these YouTube videos where all the gardens are made of steel, all the beds are made of steel, or all the beds are made of cinder blocks. I'm like, where are these people getting the money? I've got a good job, my wife has a good job. We could afford to do all of that, but I mean, why would you spend like $1,000 on materials to grow, why would you spend $300 on a garden bed that's going to give you maybe, $100 worth of produce, one single bed, right? I just can't justify in terms of return on investment, that sort of mentality. But, I am a bit of a cheapskate, so you got to think about what's important to you. I would rather save the money on my garden bed, pay off my mortgage, and get out of debt. That's my priority, right? Once you're out of debt, you've got, options other people don't have. So for me, as soon as I bought the house, it was a race against time to pay off the debt. But anyway, different topic, and I think I've covered that in other things. Also, in terms of your paths, you've got to think about those materials. Gravel versus sand versus wood chips versus sawdust, or just having grass growing there and mowing it. I mean, for me, the easiest thing to do, in one sense, is to just leave it as grass and mow it. And then you got to mow it. You got to mow it, right? Especially where I live, because we got ticks. So you have to, if you've got grass in between your garden beds, you're basically asking for a tick situation. That's why I initially used wood chips. There was a guy I could get them from. He'd dump like almost a dump truck load full here every year, and it would cost like $100. I know a lot of these YouTube videos and wood chip gardening videos talk about, wood chips, people just giving them away. It's very rare. If someone's chipping up a tree right next to you, they'll probably give them to you for free if they haven't promised them to someone, because it's handy for them to get rid of them. But a lot of things have to go right for that to be the case. If it's, if you need wood chips and there's no one chipping trees in your neighborhood, you're going to have to get a wood chip guy to come to you. Where I live, you got to pay a guy to do that. Especially, I'm sort of outside of, I'm not even on city, sewage or anything like that. We've got a septic field here, so I'm outside of town. So a guy in a big truck has to drive 20 minutes. It's a 40-minute detour, because he's going to take some 20 minutes to get here, take some 20 minutes to get back to where he came from. I got to give that guy some money. So once a year, I pay a guy $100, and he'd come in and dump a dump truck load of wood chips, and then I'd spend like, a couple weekends just wheelbarrowing it back and forth from the driveway to the garden. It was beautiful. It looked very nice. I love walking on them. It's quiet. They're excellent weed suppressor, and a lot of advantages to using the wood chips in the garden paths. But I became concerned about ticks and that sort of thing, because wood chips are better than grass. But moles and mice and all those sorts of things, they like the environment, and they carry the little juvenile ticks, and those ones can be found in stuff like that. I had one of my podcasts, I had an expert on ticks from one of the universities here talking about them, Vet Lloyd. So I became very concerned about, my kids and wife being in the garden, and these little tiny ticks that are the size of a head of a pin that can give you Lyme disease, and the risk of that. I mean, the risk is, I don't know what the risk is. Where I live, this is basically as high risk an area as anywhere else in Nova Scotia for ticks. So it didn't used to be, 20 years ago, there wasn't any here. Now you got to think about it all the time. So I just switched to sand as opposed to gravel. If you have a gravel driveway, you've probably got weeds in your gravel driveway. Gravel does not suppress weeds. If anything, weeds love gravel. You got a weed seed, it falls in the lands on the gravel driveway. It works its way down through the cracks, finds a spot that is just right for it to get germinated, and if it's tenacious enough, it can grow in your driveway. Dandelions, there's all kinds of tenacious weeds that can grow that way. So, because every piece of gravel is a stone, and every piece of stone keeps the soil that's underneath it, regardless of how poor that soil is, it keeps the soil that's underneath it moist, right? It casts shade on, every piece of gravel is a tiny stone, and every stone casts shade on whatever's underneath it. Right, so you've got all these little seeds around the edge of the stone. If you use gravel in your walking paths, unless you're doing an incredible amount of work with landscaping fabric and all this sort of stuff, you're going to have weeds. And even if you use landscaping fabric, I guarantee you're going to have weeds eventually. And those weeds are going to be rooted in landscaping fabric, and they're not coming out. So there's many different kinds of weeds that can invade your garden. Some of them move laterally, right? So there's, over time, there are all kinds of things that can get growing in landscaping fabric. It is not the weed suppressor you think it is. I spent a number of years doing landscaping, fixing people's front gardens. Someone would say, hey, this front garden's inundated with weeds. We put landscaping fabric down, we still have weeds. And then you'd have to remove all the soil. You'd have to pull out all this landscaping fabric. It'll come out in pieces. And there'll be all kinds of roots worked into the landscaping fabric. It does not suppress weeds over the long run. It'll suppress weeds in year 1, 2, or 3, but once you get into year 4, 5, 6, 7, it doesn't seem to do any good. It's really not worth it. You're setting yourself up for a failure. You're going to get a short-term gain, but you're going to have some long-term pain with that stuff. So I switched to sand because it costs some money, but you're turning your walking path into a desert, right? There's only a few kinds of seeds that can land in sand, establish roots in the sand that'll get down. Once you get down 2 or 3 inches in the sand where I am, it's actually, there's moisture, and a tenacious weed can find its way, but it has to, basically any weed seed that lands on that sand, when weed seeds are coming around, August, September, that's when a lot of weed seeds are in the air. They're going to land on sand, and they're going to be baking in the hot sun. So a lot of those weed seeds are going to lose their viability because they're in that harsh, very unnatural environment for the ecosystem here. There's not a lot of desert here in Nova Scotia, right? So most of the things that grow naturally here, they're really not equipped to just being baked in full sun, sitting on something like sand. And the sand gets very hot, and that's another advantage of using sand for paths. And I got videos on sand pathways speaking to the virtues. For where I am anyway, we got a problem insofar as it's very difficult to get enough heat to have a good garden here. Well, having sand pathways solves that problem, because you think of something like sandstone, right? That's just sand stuck together. So if you've got sand pathways, it's like all your pathways are made of a stone that isn't very solid, right? But the sand pathways hold heat in the same way that stone would, because it's just aggregate stone. It's just tiny, it's just a collection of teeny tiny stones. Anyone that's gone to a beach on a hot day, if you're walking on, you never get your feet burned by walking across someone's lawn. But if you walk on hot sand in full sun during the day, it can be too hot to stand on, right? Sand gathers and holds heat. So if you're living somewhere that cools down every night and has to reheat every morning, and like a coastal maritime type situation, if you're a maritime gardener, right, you're always looking for ways to capture heat, capture sun. It tends to be foggy here, so there's a lot of summer days where the sun, actually I can't even see the sun shining until like 11:30 in the morning. If I go inland, if I drive inland 40 minutes, even 30 minutes, the sun's shining as early as 9 a.m. Basically there's no haze, but where I live, the ocean's about 2-3 kilometers that way. There's just this fog and haze every single morning in the summer, and it doesn't burn off till, some mornings it's gone, but some mornings it's there till like noon, right? And so this, the garden, the plants in the garden are not getting sun, they're not getting the heat until that happens. So when the sun is shining, you want to do everything you can to turn your garden into a solar receptacle and capture that heat, right? So we get that sand heated up, heats up all day. And then when the sun goes down, there's like a little, I'd love to get an infrared camera out and look at the garden at night. I bet you it's glowing, right? Because it's like one giant rock. It's like a giant desert with every single garden bed's like an oasis in that desert. Works really well for me. That was something I didn't figure out in the first place. I just, working through problems and evolving as a gardener in this space, learning how to work here. It seems to work really, really well. So just some considerations along that. Another thing you have to consider is, and I'm sorry if there's some noise in the background here, one of my neighbors is hammering something. I could solve that by doing the podcasts indoors, but I've found that, at least on YouTube, the ones I film outside do a lot better. People just prefer this setting than seeing me in this dry, dead office. This is nice here. You can hear birds, you can hear the wind. But part of that is you hear your neighbor swinging a hammer sometimes. Thank God he's not using a chainsaw. So that would shut the whole thing down. Anyway, one other thing you have to think about is rotations, right? Where are you going to place everything in that garden, and how's your rotations going to work, right? So, some of my viewers say, well, you don't need to rotate perennials, so you don't need to rotate anything. Or this gardener doesn't do rotations, so you don't need to do it. Like, what's his name? Charles Dowding. They'll say, Charles Dowding did a video and he showed that he doesn't need to rotate his vegetables. Well, that's true, but Charles Dowding brings in compost. He adds, an inch or so of compost to every bed every year. So he's not planting none of his gardens are the same garden from year to year. He's adding stuff, right, on quite a scale. An inch of compost takes a lot of material to make an inch of compost. My gardens, I mulch them. The mulch breaks down and composts in the garden, but it's not adding an inch a year. It's probably adding a 1/4 inch a year, right? Works just fine, so I don't bother doing what he does. But he's adding a lot of material. His gardens aren't getting depleted because he's replenishing them every year to a large extent, right? And that's more work than what I'm doing, but that works for him and that's fine. And he's got perfectly good reasons for why he does what I do. And I've got perfectly good reasons, I think, for what I do, right? But I think if you do a really good perusal of the literature on gardening, on growing vegetables, there's an argument for rotating your crops. And it can be as simple as having a three bed rotation or a 4-bed rotation. I tend to stick with that. And you just put I'm not doing this podcast isn't on rotations, but there's categories of vegetables you shouldn't have planted in the same bed from year to year, because they tend to are susceptible to the same diseases, tend to be susceptible to the same pests, and they tend to have similar requirements from the soil, right? So it's better to move them from place to place for all those reasons. There's also kinds of plants like legumes, beans and peas, that can actually, they don't really have a nitrogen requirement of the soil. So if you're mulching your garden every single year, your soil is getting replenished with nitrogen every year. So in any given year, if you plant something that doesn't require nitrogen because it can capture its own from the air, your garden's going to get more nitrogen, because if you're mulching, the soil organisms are going to convert and break down the mulching material, and they're going to distribute, the nitrogen content in the soil is going to increase because of the activity of the soil organisms, the worms and stuff, on your mulch. The plant isn't going to take the nitrogen out of the soil if it's a legume, because it doesn't need to. It can make its own. And In some cases, that legume will fix some nitrogen in its roots. If you leave the plant roots in the soil, there's the chance, to some degree, that that plant will, help the soil out and leave a little nitrogen behind, right? So it's good to, at the very least, you should always grow beans and peas, and you should work them into the rotation. Every bed should get a bean or a pea planted into it at least once every 4 years. That's what I try to do here. That's why I grow a lot of beans and peas, mostly beans, but peas too. They're pretty easy to store. I just blanch and freeze them when we use them. We're still using them. We're almost out, but all our peas are gone. We got some beans left now. So you work that into your rotation. Your squash, you work that into your rotation. Your potatoes is another sort of category. Potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. They're all the same family. All right, so if I had a potato here in year A, I can't put peppers or eggplant or whatever the other thing I mentioned in that same spot, right? So these are all things you have to consider when you're thinking about a crop rotation. And when you're planning out your garden, where's everything going to go? How does the crop rotation work with that? It's something you have to think about. And it may be the case that I'm making it sound complicated, but when you lay it all out on a piece of paper and draw it up, it's actually not that complicated at all. I'm going to be doing I'm actually in the process of editing it right now, where I'm planning out next year's garden. I do it every single year. You can look, it'll say 2020 garden plan. If you just do a search on my channel for the word garden plan, you'll see my garden plan for last year and the year before and the year before that, right? And then you can look at if you're interested, if you want to do that sort of thing, for a given year, like 2020, look at my 2020 garden plan, and then look at my garden tour in July of that same year. That's usually the height of the gardening season. And, compare the plan to what actually happened, right? I usually change it a little bit, but I stick to it for the most part. And there's lots of good reasons to have a garden plan. So I'm going to be doing a video on that soon. But yeah, think about your rotations. And also, when you think about your rotations, just like when you're playing chess, you should think 3 moves ahead. When you're thinking about your rotations, think 3 seasons ahead. 3 years from now, this is going to be peas. 3 years from now, that's going to be potatoes. 3 years from now, right? Think that way. Think in multiple seasons, right? You'll find it's a lot easier, way less overwhelming every spring to figure out where everything goes. And it gets you into the rhythm of your garden. You're sort of plugged into it, and you and your garden become one, that sort of thing. But it really does sort of plug you into what's happening. Any sort of ecosystem like a forest, it's not a one-season thing. It's a multi-season thing. It's a multi-year thing, right? It changes every single year, and if you walk into any natural growing system in a given year, you can sort of tell what's going to happen in the future, right? So you're setting your garden to work like a natural system. You're mimicking natural systems in your garden. Natural systems are multi-year systems. So think about what's your multi-year plan for your garden. What's it going to look like 2 years, 3 years? How do the rotations work into all of that? Finally, last point on ordering seeds. Don't order your seeds until you've decided where they're all going to go in your garden. I can't stress that enough. That's basically why I do the garden plan video. I show you all the things I want to order, then I try to find a place to put them, right? I mean, my process is, of course, the sponsor for this channel is Vessi Seeds. They give me all my seeds for free, so I get almost everything from them, right? So I go on their website, and I go from A to B. Ooh, I want those. Artichoke. Oh, yeah, I'd love to have artichoke. Oh, asparagus. I'd love to have some asparagus. Oh, tomato. Well, that's not a beet. Beans, beets, Brussels sprouts. Yeah, and I go from A to B, and I just write down everything I want and the variety I want. And then I've got a list. And then I have a picture of my garden, and I just label every single bed. That's where the Brussels sprouts are going to go. That's where the beans are going to go. I try to find a place for everything, bearing in mind all the considerations I mentioned earlier in this podcast. How much sun there is, where the perennials are stuck, all that sort of stuff, right? And I usually find as I get towards, 7/8 of the list being done, 80% of the list or whatever, I haven't have enough space for everything I picked out on my list. So now I got to start doing that decision. Okay, what can I live without? Do I really need the Brussels sprouts? Well, the kids aren't that great. I like them, but the kids aren't. Okay, forget the Brussels sprouts. Something's got to go. Last year I didn't plant something that I've tried to plant. What was it? I can't remember. But last year I decided to I didn't plant kohlrabi. I've planted kohlrabi every year for 5 years. I decided not to bother with kohlrabi. I planted collard greens instead. And this year I actually think I'm going to plant cabbage instead of collard greens or kohlrabi. They're all kind of the same thing in a sense, right? You use them in similar kinds of dishes. It's hard to decide. I do like collard greens. But anyway, these are all decisions you have to make. So my best advice is start with want. I want. Make a list of all the things you want. And then look at your space and say, what's possible? I can't, like the Rolling Stones song says, you can't always get what you want. So you're limited in your space. Do you have a space for all the things you want? Because if you don't, you got to decide not to want some of those things. And then you don't have to buy stuff. The worst thing you do is you buy a whole bunch of, like I'm getting this stuff for free, but you're buying it. And by the way, if you are buying it, you can get it, shipped for free from Vessi Seeds if you use the coupon code GAVS21. But you're buying it, so don't buy anything you're not going to use. Some seeds keep their viability for years, but some seeds like parsnips, carrots, their viability almost drops in half each year, right? So they're only optimally viable in year one. So you don't want to be buying things you're not going to plant that year. So try to use a process like that. And that's literally what the video I'm working on. It's going to be something like 2021 garden plan. It'll be out soon. That's literally what that video is about. Here's all the things I want. Now, where the heck do I stick all this stuff, right? So that's the last step. Once you've figured all that other stuff out, what do I want to grow? Do I have room for it all? Do I have meaningful room for it all? It wouldn't make sense to plant 3 bean plants, right? It's just not, depends on if you're living alone. We're a family of 4, so, I got a lot of mouths to feed, and the kids are starting to eat as much as me now, because they're 10 and 12 years old and they're growing fast. So there's certain things they like, so I plant a lot of them. I usually have 3 beds of beans, and we eat as many as we can when they're producing, but we also freeze as many as we can while they're producing. And then we eat them, right? And I usually have 2 beds of kale because we eat a lot of that, and we all like it, and we use it a lot, right? But these are all things you have to think about. What are we going to eat? What does everybody like? How much do you need to plant to get the meaningful yield that you want relative to how much you plan to eat that thing? All right, so those are the considerations. Where is the sun? Where do the perennials need to be? Paths and beds. Where are the beds going to be? Where are the paths going to be? What are they made of? That sort of thing. Thinking about the rotations, and where's it all going to go, right? Where are all those things you want to grow going to go? Do you have a space for it all, right? To me, those are top things you need to consider when you're planning a garden. Whether you've got no garden, you're going 0 to 60, or you've already got a garden and you're just getting, planning things out for next year. It's the same consideration regardless. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe. If you want to help support this channel, check out my sponsors, Vessi Seeds and Safer's Gardening Products. The Vessis, go to their website, vessis.com, I believe is the website. You use my coupon code GAVS21 to get free shipping on any order in their seed catalog, as long as you've got 1 package of seeds in the order. The details are in the description box for this video. If you're on my website, it's in the show notes for this podcast, if you're downloading just the audio podcast. Safer's you can buy Safer stuff online, but you can also buy it from Vessi Seeds. So buy their stuff from Vessi Seeds. That'll make Safer's happy. And you can get free shipping as long as you include a package of seeds in the order for the Safer's product. I only use 3 of their products. I sought them out as a sponsor. They didn't call me, I sought them out. I used their slug and snail killer, I used their end-all, and I used their, sometimes BTK. I didn't even need it last year. Didn't use it once. Other years I've had a really bad problem with the caterpillars on my brassicas, on my kale and stuff like that. I've used it to sort it out. So for Safer's, their products, they're all designed with the organic gardener in mind, have minimal impact on the ecosystem where your soil is, right? Made with things that break down into benign substances that really aren't going to have an impact, a negative impact in any meaningful way. That's why I use their products. That's why I sought them out as a sponsor, because it works for me. There are lots of other ways to deal with pests, and you use whatever way works for you. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. But yeah, if you want to help support the channel, check them out. One more thing, I got a new channel, outdoors channel, called Outdoors on the Cheap. I've been making some videos. I've probably got about a dozen videos now. This time of year, I love to be out in the woods. There's no flies, there's no mosquitoes, right? It's just a great time to be out doing stuff. And it's one of my other passions. I like fishing, I like hiking, I like camping out in the woods all seasons. I've fairly skilled, experienced, bush practitioner of the art of bushcraft, and I've been like that for years and years and years. So I've got a new channel. I've got a promotion right now. If you subscribe, if you're one of the first 1,000 subscribers, you get a chance to win one of these more basic bushcraft knives. I got 3 of these knives. So if you're one of the first 1,000 subscribers, you have a chance to win one of those 3 knives. Every time I get a new subscriber, I just add the name to a list. And eventually, when I got 1,000 subscribers, I'll randomly choose 3 people from that list to win that. I also have a big box of stuff that Safers has given me over the years as my sponsor that I don't use, that I don't need. I'll put a link to a video. I got a video speaking about this promotion. And so if you don't want this knife, you can have one of those things, or even 2 of those things for that matter, because I don't need them. There's they're basically pest solutions for pests I don't have, like Japanese beetle. I don't have that, right? Or potato, I don't have potato bugs. Colorado potato beetle, right? They've got stuff for that. I don't have that problem. And they got other things that solve other problems I don't have. So they're just sitting around, not really doing much use. I might as well give them away. So if you're one of the first 1,000 subscribers to Outdoors on the Cheap, you can choose from among those things as well. That's fine. I'll just, we'll work out the details and I'll ship it out to you. So yeah, just one other thing. If you're an outdoorsy sort of person and you find yourself, the idea of the channels, I'm just off the beaten path. So it's for people that go in the woods with a compass. Like for me, it's often I'm trying to find some lake in the middle of nowhere, or for some river. You pull over on the side of the highway and you just walk into the woods using your compass, and you're going to be walking for a few hours to find some river somewhere. So you're at risk of being lost, and of course it's rough terrain, so you don't want to carry any more than, you're not walking on a trail, you're walking through the forest like an animal. So every pound you bring makes it that much more difficult, so you travel light. But as the bushcraft model goes, the more you know, the less you carry. So you pack all this knowledge in your mind of how to use the things you can find out in the woods to just make things more enjoyable and solve problems as they come up. And also because it's called Outdoors on the Cheap, as you might imagine, a lot of bushcraft channels, I watch a lot of this content on YouTube, I'm into it. Seems like their total goal is to sell you knives, sell you axes, and most of these things are unbelievably expensive. I've never used expensive gear out in the woods. I've always gotten by just fine. If you know what you're doing, it's not about the cost of the gear, it's about knowing what you're spending your money on, what its limitations are and what its capabilities are, and how to use that tool. The more you know about how to use the tool, the less money you have to spend. Also, the more you just know about the properties of these various tools, knife, axe, saw, compass, things like that. The more you know about the properties of what makes a good tool, the less you have to spend. So yeah, check that out. I got a handful of videos so far, certainly not as many as my gardening channel, but it's just another thing I'm doing. If you subscribe, you get a chance to win a cool bushcraft knife. So that's it for this week's podcast, or this month's podcast. I hope you found it interesting, and until next time, I hope you watched that video where I plan my garden, but until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.